Mauritius became independent in 1968, the Chagos archipelago was not part of its territory. This was Mauritius's own position in the years following independence, reaffirming as a sovereign state the agreement entered into by its representatives in 1965. Before I turn to the details, let me make two introductory points on the facts. Firstly, central to Mauritius's position, if not the entirety of its arguments on consent, is the meeting between the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson and the then Mauritian Premier Seewoosagur Ramgoolam on the morning of the 23rd of September of 1965. Mauritius focuses on a short internal minute prepared for the British Prime Minister ahead of the meeting that noted that the Prime Minister should frighten the Premier with hope, and also on one small part of the United Kingdom's very own summary of the meeting. In its written comments, Mauritius further asserts that the United Kingdom has not produced, and I quote, a single document to directly contradict the contention that the British Prime Minister threatened the Premier with non-independence if the detachment of the Chagos archipelago was not agreed, close quotes. That is not correct, but it is anyway for Mauritius, claiming decades after the event that consent was given under duress to meet its burden of proof and make good its factual assertions. It has not done so. To ascertain the facts, the most obvious and relevant place to look is at what those present had to say about what actually took place. In particular, of course, the Mauritian Premier and then its Prime Minister, Seewoosagur Ramgoolam, as he is the only person who could speak to the issue of whether Mauritius considered itself to be under any duress. And here, and at tab 4 in your folders, is what he had to say, and I quote, "The government of Mauritius was nevertheless informed after we had discussed in England that this had taken place, and we gave our consent to it. It was done like this, but the day it is not required, it will revert to Mauritius. But Mauritius has reserved its mineral rights, fishing rights, and landing rights, and certain other things that go to complete, in other words, some of the sovereignty which obtained before on that island. That is the position. This, in principle, was agreed even by the PMSD, who was in the opposition at the time, and we had consultations, and this was done in the interest of the Commonwealth, not of Mauritius only. This is all I can say about Diego." End of quotation. These were the words of the Mauritian Prime Minister in the Mauritius Legislative Assembly on the 26th of June of 1974. And notably, he said this as people in the opposition were accusing him of giving away the islands. It would have been easy, natural almost, for the Mauritian Prime Minister to shift the blame from himself and say he had in some sense been or felt forced to agree to detachment, if that had been the case. But he did not. As late as November 1979, in response to a question in the Legislative Assembly on when the islands will be returned, the Mauritian Prime Minister made no suggestion that the 1965 agreement was invalid, but stated the accepted legal position at tab 5, and I quote, "The islands will be returned to Mauritius if the need for the facilities there disappeared. How soon this will be done, I cannot say," end of quote. When later asked directly in the Legislative Assembly in November of 1980 if detachment was a precondition for independence, the Mauritian Prime Minister answered unequivocally in the negative. And you'll see at tab 6, and I quote, "It was a matter that was negotiated. We got some advantage out of this, and we agreed," end of quote. And even in 1982, when Mauritius had shifted its position and was now openly disputing sovereignty, former Prime Minister Ramgoolam was consistent in his attitude towards the events of 1965. In his memoirs published in that year, he described his triumphant victory in the Constitutional Conference and says nothing whatsoever about pressure, coercion, duress, or blackmail. He speaks only of the complete success Mauritius had achieved at the 1965 Constitutional Conference. So Seewoosagur, therefore, was always clear that Mauritius consented to detachment and that he himself expressed his consent to that detachment. He, the key person at the meeting who alone would have known if there was coercion that had an impact on his consent, did not suggest that this was the case. The second introductory remark is that Mauritius's assertions that there was opposition to detachment expressed by their representatives during and after the 1965 Constitutional Conference are entirely inaccurate. Mauritius claims that at a cabinet meeting a few hours after the Premier's meeting with the British Prime Minister, the Colonial Secretary informed his cabinet colleagues that, and I quote, the Parti Mauricien had informed him that since they were opposed to independence, they could not agree to the detachment of the islands, end of quote. Mauritius neglects to mention, however, why the Parti Mauricien opposed detachment and how, in the very next sentence, the Colonial Secretary detailed the proposed agreement and said that, and I quote, the leaders of the other parties, including the Premier, had agreed to the proposal in principle, end of quote. So what he in fact said is that a minority of 5 ministers out of a delegation of 28 objected to the agreement. Mauritius likewise claims that, and I quote, immediately after the 1965 Constitutional Conference, Governor Rennie informed the Colonial Secretary of the strong belief that there had been a deal between the British government and the Mauritius Labour Party in which independence has been granted for the sake of Diego Garcia, close quote. In this respect, also, aside from basing itself on rumours, Mauritius neglects to share with the court the crux of the issue to which the governor was alluding. In fact, the issue was about the adequacy of the compensation for detachment. What Governor Rennie in fact wrote is at tab 7 and on the screen, and it was the following, and I quote, the Parti Mauricien ministers were unable to accept this majority decision and resigned on the grounds that compensation to Mauritius and assurances given were inadequate. As regards the resignation of the PMSD ministers, he adds, they all said that they were agreeable in principle to detachment for defence purposes, but found the terms unsatisfactory. And the governor noted that the public and I should say that all ministers think the compensation inadequate. In particular, they are gravely disappointed that nothing could be done about sugar. End of quote. This theme, namely that compensation was too low, was the only issue taken by the Parti Mauricien against detachment. This formed part of the real bone of contention during the Constitutional Conference. It was an internal Mauritian debate between the majority of ministers who were for independence and wanted the question decided at a general election, and the minority of ministers who sought association with the United Kingdom, that is the Parti Mauricien, and were seeking a plebiscite. Had the Parti Mauricien believed that independence was being given in exchange for the archipelago, they would have said so loud and clear, as they were in opposition to the majority's position on the need for independence. But they made no such statements. They only questioned the amount of compensation for detachment, and in no way portrayed this as part of a package on independence. And this is consistent with the general attitude of all the parties in Mauritius which was that the two issues of independence and detachment were not intertwined. Mr. President, members of the Court, I now turn to the chronology of the key facts, and you may wish to look at the chronology document that we provided at tab 8 in your folders and on the screen. And going through the evidence, I shall make three fundamental points. A, that Mauritian ministers were inclined to agree to detachment soon after it was first raised by the United Kingdom, and try to negotiate the best possible terms both before, during and after the Constitutional Conference. B, that the chronology of the events negates any claim that duress was exerted on the 23rd of September of 1965. Indeed, official consent to detachment was given by Mauritian ministers on the 5th of November, some 6 weeks later. And thirdly, C, that Mauritius reaffirmed the 1965 agreement time and time again post-independence. I start in mid-1965. Mauritius contends that all agree that, and I quote, when inquiries were made by the administering power, Mauritian ministers expressed opposition to detachment, end of quote. That's not correct. Mauritius also goes on to claim in their written comments, I quote, from the earliest approaches in April and July of 1965, Mauritian ministers were steadfast and resolute in their opposition to the detachment of the Chagos archipelago. This opposition continued throughout the Constitutional Conference, end of quote. This is, again, incorrect. In fact, the Mauritian leaders indicated their agreement to the idea of an agreement on detachment almost immediately. The plans for a military facility in the Chagos archipelago were raised with the Mauritian leaders in July of 1965, well before the September Constitutional Conference. At no stage did they reject the plan, and their initial hesitation lasted for just 1 week. The Mauritian leaders then advised the governor that they were sympathetically disposed to the request and turned to negotiating the terms of an agreement. As the terms of the deal were being brokered, it was Mauritian ministers who suggested that the matter be discussed in London at the forthcoming Constitutional Conference. This was done, despite the fact that British officials repeatedly expressed the preference to keep the matters of independence and negotiations over detachment separate. For example, on the 3rd of September of 1965, the Colonial Secretary said to the Mauritian Premier, and it appears at tab 9 in your bundle, and I quote, that it was unfortunate that discussions on the UK-US defence proposals came at the same time as the conference. He said that it would be necessary to discuss these separately and in parallel, and not let them get mixed up with the conference. The Seewoosagur Ramgoolam agreed, end of quote. Turning to the Constitutional Conference of September of that year, Mauritius asserts that the refusal to consider detachment by its representatives continued throughout the Constitutional Conference, up to and including the second meeting on defence matters on the 20th of September of 1965. And it says that only on the 23rd of September, after the Wilson-Ramgoolam meeting, did 3 Mauritian ministers express for the first time their agreement in principle to the detachment of the Chagos archipelago. However, the court has the benefit of the account of the events in the Chagos Arbitration Award, which was made following detailed argument. The award gives a very different account so far as concerns the meetings of the 13th, 20th and 23rd of September of 1965. And you'll see at tab 10 the following, and I quote, over the course of 3 meetings, the Mauritian leaders pressed the United Kingdom with respect to the compensation offered for Mauritian agreement to the detachment of the archipelago, noting the involvement of the United States in the establishment of the defence facility and Mauritius's need for continuing economic support." End of quote. The Mauritian ministers were negotiating from the beginning to get what they considered a good deal for the detachment of a distant archipelago. And, consistent with the factual determination of the tribunal in the Chagos arbitration, it is impossible to reconcile the assertion that the Mauritius ministers were steadfast against detachment when reading the records of the meetings. For example, at the meeting of the 13th of September, Mr. Mohammed, who was then leader of the Muslim Committee of Action Party, and I quote, said he recognised that Mauritius must, in her own interests, make facilities available. At this meeting, Mr. Paturai, an independent, also said that he recognised the necessity for defence facilities of this sort and felt that Mauritius should agree they could not remain in a void in the Indian Ocean, end of quote. To similar effect, the Mauritian Premier stated in the 20th of September meeting about detachment, and you'll see that at tab 12, that he, and I quote, fully understood the desirability of this, not only in the interests of Mauritius, but in those of the whole Commonwealth, a view endorsed by other ministers, end of quote. In the 20th of September of 1965 meeting, the Mauritian Premier further expressed his agreement with the following statement made by Mr. Mohammed, and I quote, "If only the UK were involved, then they would be willing to hand back Diego Garcia to the UK without any compensation. Mauritius was already under many obligations to the UK, but when the United States was involved as well, they wanted something substantial by way of continuing benefit," end of quote. The correct position is thus that Mauritian ministers, not the UK, wanted to discuss detachment during the Constitutional Conference, and they came ready to negotiate and to reach a deal on detachment on the best possible terms. And this was clearly expressed prior to the meeting between the British Prime Minister and the Mauritian Premier, and it forms the real backdrop to that meeting. The terms were provisionally agreed on the 23rd of September and thereafter amended at the request of Mauritian ministers on the 1st of October, and they're before you at tab 13. On the 23rd of September, the Mauritian Premier, I quote, said that the terms were acceptable to him and Mr. Bisson-Doyle and Mr. Mohammed in principle, but he expressed the wish to discuss it with his other ministerial colleagues, end of quote. The condition that the islands would be returned to Mauritius when no longer needed for defence purposes was the idea of the Mauritian Premier himself. Mauritius received various benefits in return, including monetary compensation and commitments on external defence and internal security, in addition to the commitment to cede the islands to Mauritius when no longer needed for defence purposes. The Colonial Secretary's minutes stated, and I quote, "I hope we shall be as generous as possible, and I'm sure we should not seem to be trading independence for detachment of the islands. Agreement is therefore desirable. The ideal would be for us to be able to announce that the Mauritius government had agreed." End of quote. The summary record of the meeting shows that the Premier was positively inclined to reaching an agreement on detachment. I quote, "Seewoosagur reaffirmed that he and his colleagues were very ready to play their part," close quotes. Mr. President, let me, at this point, clarify a misconception that Mauritius insists upon. At the Constitutional Conference, agreement was reached on independence for Mauritius. The United Kingdom policy in favour of independence was publicly announced on the 24th of September of 1965. As is clear from the timeline that you have at tab 8, consent to detachment was not given at this meeting, but rather 6 weeks later in Port Louis on the 5th of November 1965. It was on that day that the Council of Ministers gave its agreement after debate and subject to certain further understandings recorded in the minutes of proceedings of the meeting, and in a telegram from the Governor to the Secretary of State for the Colonies of the same date. Now that is wholly inconsistent with Mauritius's position that the Mauritian Premier was put into a situation amounting to duress, which resulted in consent granted at the conclusion of the meeting of the 23rd of September. And there are 2 points to add. Firstly, for the United Kingdom, it would have been politically impossible to step back from its publicly stated commitment to Mauritius's independence. The clear policy of Britain from the late 1950s was to promote the independence for those of its dependent territories that wanted it. I need only recall Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's celebrated Winds of Change speech delivered in early 1960. It would have been inconceivable, we say, for a British government, having announced its commitment to independence for its possessions in Africa, to reverse its decision. That was the clear line of policy of governments of both political parties from the late 1950s onwards. Second, such opposition as there was in Mauritius to detachment of the Chagos archipelago focused on one issue: the amount of compensation given to Mauritius. The chronology shows that there was a period of 6 weeks where consent to the detachment was conditional, a period in which the United Kingdom was already publicly committed to Mauritius's independence. The representatives of Mauritius provisionally approved the detachment at Lancaster House, but then ministers returned home, and the Parti mauricien let it be known immediately that they did not agree to the detachment because the compensation was too low in their view. At a press conference on the 24th of September of 1975, the Mauritian Prime Minister publicly stated that the British had paid for sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago and now could do what they liked with it. This is at tab 17. An excerpt in which the Prime Minister of Mauritius reaffirms his country's consent to detachment is now on your screens, and I will read it. It seemed clear that the retention of the Chagos was not an issue for Sir S. Ramgoolam, the Mauritian Prime Minister. During his talks on the 24th of September with Mr. Reynolds, the Minister of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, he had been given every chance to raise the Diego Garcia issue, but had not done so. Moreover, at his press conference later the same day, he had said that the British had paid for sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago and now could do what they liked with it, end of quote. It is also to be noted that in June of 1980, Tromelin, which was disputed between Mauritius and France, was added to the territory of Mauritius by the Legislative Assembly via the Interpretation and General Clauses Act. At the time, the Assembly made a deliberate decision not to add the Chagos archipelago to that act, thus reflecting the validity of Mauritius's agreement to detachment. On the following day, the Mauritian Prime Minister made a statement to the press, and you have that at tab 18, saying as follows: Diego Garcia was excised by the British government by an order in council before our independence in 1968. Actually, the whole procedure took place in 1965. This was a very important decision to take. We were consulted, and we agreed to give away Diego Garcia, and the British government paid us £3 million in compensation. As a result of the excision, Diego Garcia became part of what is known as the British Indian Ocean Territories, and Great Britain has sovereignty over it. And the day Great Britain doesn't need Diego Garcia will be returned to us without compensation. Mr. President, members of the court, to summarise, the Chagos Islands were administered as a dependency of Mauritius for reasons of administrative convenience. They were not considered an integral part of Mauritius, from which they are very distant. Mauritius and the people of Mauritius, through their representatives, consented to the detachment of the Chagos archipelago in return for important commitments by the United Kingdom, including the commitment to cede the islands to Mauritius once they were no longer needed for defence purposes. And Mauritius's assertion that its consent, which it does not deny, was vitiated by duress is without merit. The consent that was initially given in September 1965 at Lancaster House was confirmed by the Mauritius Council of Ministers in November of that year and was later reconfirmed on many occasions by Mauritius as a sovereign state.